Some stories don't begin with a hero riding into the sunset. They begin at a dusty stagecoach stop, with a man turning his hat in his hands, waiting for a woman he's never met. This is one of those stories, a quiet one. Set in the summer of 1883, in a small Wyoming town most maps forgot to name. It's about a rancher named Elias Miller, who ordered a bride through letters because the silence in his house had grown too heavy for one man to carry. And it's about Mary Colton, who answered that advertisement not because she dreamed of love, but because she had run out of places to hide. If you've ever watched someone rebuild after the worst has happened, or if you've done it yourself, then you already know how this kind of story feels. It moves slow. It earns every inch. The last stagecoach of the day was 40 minutes late. Elias Miller stood beside his buckboard, one boot on the wheel hub, and turned his hat in his hands for the 11th time. The brim had gone soft, where his thumb kept working the felt. He put it back on, took it off. The depot agent, a bow-legged man named Polk, leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching. "She ain't coming. You keep fiddling with that hat," Polk said. "Mind your business. Polk, I'm just saying, a man wants to make a good impression. He ought to quit sweating through his Sunday shirt before the lady even gets here." Elias looked down. A dark half-moon of sweat had spread beneath each arm. He tugged his vest closed and said nothing. The letter was in his breast pocket. He'd read it 3 times since morning, the last one Mary Colton had sent from Harrisburg. Pennsylvania. 5 weeks ago. Neat handwriting, slanted slightly left. The ink careful and even. She'd written about the weather, about the price of train fare, about how she hoped the journey wouldn't be too much trouble. That last line still sat wrong in his chest. "I will be no trouble to you." "Mr. Miller, who writes that to a man she's about to marry?" "Not, I look forward to meeting you." "Not, I hope we'll get along." Just, "I will be no trouble," like she was apologizing for arriving. He folded the letter back into his pocket and squinted down the road. Heat shimmered above the packed dirt. A red-tailed hawk circled once over the depot roof and drifted south. Then dust, a brown column of it rising beyond the ridge, and the faint rattle of iron wheels on hard pan. "There she is," Polk said, and pushed off the doorframe. The coach came in hard, the driver hauling back on the reins with both hands, the 4 horses blowing and stamping. Dust swirled up and Elias stepped back, pulling his bandana over his nose. The driver, a thick-armed man named Guthrie, who ran the Cheyenne to Sheridan line, jumped down and spat into the dirt. "Running late," Guthrie said, as if anyone needed telling. He reached under the seat and tossed a brown envelope onto the depot bench. "That's from her folks. They was real particular I handed over." Elias looked at the envelope, then at the coach door. It opened from inside. A hand appeared, first small, knuckles white around the door edge, and then a woman stepped down onto the iron footplate and onto the ground. She was younger than he'd expected, 25, maybe 26, though the way she held herself added years, shoulders drawn in, chin tucked, eyes fixed on the toes of her lace-up boots. She wore a calico dress that had been washed past its original color, and she carried a leather valise with one clasp missing, the other green with tarnish. She gripped the remaining handle with both hands, the valise pressed against her hip like a shield. Then she looked up. The bruise covered most of her left cheekbone. Purple-black at the center, fading to yellow-green at the edges. The size of a man's thumb knuckle, not fresh 4, maybe 5 days old, but unmistakable. Someone had hit her, someone right-handed, from the angle of it, and someone who hadn't held back. Elias felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. He made himself breathe. He picked up the brown envelope from the bench. No return address. He tore it open. Inside, a single sheet of cheap paper. The handwriting nothing like Mary's. This was heavy. Slanting. Careless. 6 words. She's your problem now. He read it twice, folded it, slid it into his back pocket, away from Mary's letter, which sat over his heart. 2 pieces of paper. 2 different languages about the same woman. Miss Colton. She flinched, just barely a tightening around the eyes. A half step back, but he saw it. He made his voice slower, lower, the way he talked to the young mare he'd been breaking last spring, the one that spooked at shadows. I'm Elias Miller. He gestured toward the buckboard. Got a bit of a ride to the ranch, but the road's not bad this time of year. You must be tired from all that traveling. She looked at him, not at his face, but at his hands. Checking. He recognized what she was doing because he'd seen the mare do the same thing, measuring the distance between herself and the nearest threat. Let me take that for you, he said, and reached slowly for the valise. Her fingers tightened on the handle, then released. He set the valise in the back of the buckboard and offered his hand to help her up. She didn't take it. She climbed up on her own, gripping the seat rail, and settled herself on the far end of the bench. Her back was straight as a fence post, her hands folded on her lap, one on top of the other, covering the knuckles. Elias climbed up the other side, took the reins, clicked his tongue. The buckboard rolled out of Cedar Hollow as the sun dropped behind the Bighorn Ridge, painting the sky and the color of a peach, left too long on the branch. Crickets started up in the sagebrush. The wheels creaked over a rut, and Mary swayed her hand, shot out to the seat rail. Not to him. Road gets rough past the creek, Elias said. Eyes on the horses. Hang on to the rail. She nodded. He did not ask about the bruise. He did not mention the letter. He drove with both hands on the reins and let the silence between them fill with the sound of crickets and wheels and the soft blowing of the horses. And he thought, she needs a roof before she needs a husband. You remember that? Elias, you remember that. 3 miles of road unspooled in the fading light. Mary Colton sat 1 handspan away from the man she had agreed to marry, watching the last of the sun slide off the hills, and said nothing at all. If this story reminds you of someone you know, or someone you once were, we'd be glad to hear from you. Drop a word about where you're watching from tonight. Good company makes any porch feel wider. The ranch house was smaller than she'd pictured. 1 story. Plank walls gone silver from weather. A porch with 2 steps, and a roof that sagged in the middle like a tired spine. Somebody had swept the porch recently. The broom marks still showed in the dust, but they'd missed the corners. Elias set her valise on the porch and opened the front door. It swung inward without a sound. Oiled hinges. She noticed that. This way, he said, and stepped aside to let her pass first. The front room was kitchen and sitting room together. A cast-iron cook stove against the far wall. A rough-cut table with 2 chairs. A hutch with 5 plates and 4 cups. A Bible on the bottom shelf. Its spine cracked and soft. Everything clean in a way that suggested effort rather than habit. The table wiped, but the grain still dark with old stains. The stove blacked, but the floor around it scuffed. He led her through the back doorway into the bedroom. A bed frame with a cotton mattress. White sheets, still creased from the store. On the nightstand, a tin can with 3 black-eyed Susans stuffed in, their stems cut uneven. One already drooping. Mary looked at the flowers, then at the window, then at the iron bolt on the inside of the door. "Locks from inside," Elias said behind her. He cleared his throat. "I fixed up the loft in the barn for myself, got a cot and a lantern up there. So." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You need anything? Holler." She turned to face him. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands again, his shoulders taking up most of the frame. Big man, wide through the chest, hands that could wrap around a fence post. She said, "Thank you. Mr. Miller?" He nodded once, put his hat on, and left. She listened. Boot steps across the front room, the plank door groaning on its leather hinges, steps on the porch. Then off it the sound changing from wood to packed dirt, crossing the yard, the barn door creaking open, then shut, quiet. Mary sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress gave under her weight, the rope springs groaning. She pressed her palms flat against the sheets. Cool cotton. She could smell the sizing in it new, stiff, bought for her. She stood up and walked to the door. Her fingers found the bolt. Cold iron under her thumb. She slid it home. Click. The sound filled the room the way a match fills a dark hallway. She stood there with her hand on the bolt. Breathing. Through the window, past the flour sack curtain. A faint glow his lantern. Up in the barn loft. He was really out there. She sat down in the rocking chair by the window. It tilted one leg shorter than the rest, and she caught herself on the sill. The chair creaked under her. Uneven. Listing to the right like a boat with a slow leak. Outside, the lantern burned steady. Inside, Mary Colton sat in the dark behind a locked door in a stranger's house in a territory she couldn't find on a map 3 months ago. And she realized she could not remember the last time she had been in a room where no one could walk in. Her throat tightened. She pressed her fist against her mouth. The rocking chair creaked, the crickets sang. And somewhere between the sound and the silence, a question surfaced that she did not want to answer, not tonight. Not yet. What kind of man gives away his own bed and sleeps in a barn, and never once asks about the bruise on your face? She woke before dawn, and didn't know where she was. Ceiling too low, wrong smell, wood smoke, and dried sage instead of coal dust and lye soap. No sound of her brother's boots on the stairs, no sound of anything except crickets winding down and a rooster starting up somewhere east of the house. Then she remembered. Wyoming, the ranch, the bolt on the door, the brief ceremony at the church, yesterday evening, Reverend Thomas reading from his worn Bible, Elias standing stiff in his clean shirt, Mary saying, "I do," to a man she'd known for 2 hours, the Reverend's wife signing as witness, no music, no flowers, just words and a signature, and then the buckboard ride home in the dark. Mary lay still and let the room come into focus. Gray light through the flour sack curtain, the tin can of black-eyed Susans on the nightstand, 2 of them drooping now. The rocking chair by the window, tilting on its short leg. A sound from the front room, the iron clank of the cook stove door, then the scrape and snap of kindling catching. He was up. She heard him move across the floor, heard water pour into something metal, heard the stove door clank shut again. Coffee. She could smell it before the kettle had time to boil the grounds hitting hot water. That first bitter bloom. She got up, smoothed the sheets, braided her hair by feel in the half-dark, and pinned it with the 2 pins she had left. Put on the calico dress, the only one she owned that wasn't torn, and laced her boots. She slid the bolt open. The sound was quieter than last night's locking. She stepped out. Elias stood at the stove with his back to her, pouring coffee from a tin pot into a tin cup. His shirt was already damp between the shoulder blades. He'd been up a while. He turned, saw her. Something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, but a quick rearrangement. The look of a man who'd been alone in his kitchen for 2 years, and suddenly wasn't. "Morning," he said. "Pot's on the stove. Cups are in the hutch, second shelf." She found a cup, poured her own coffee. Black, there was no cream. And if there was sugar, she didn't see it. The cup was hot enough to sting her palms, and she held it with both hands anyway. Elias walked out to the porch. She heard the boards creak under him. Then nothing. He'd sat down. Mary stood in the kitchen alone. The stove ticked as the fire settled. Through the open door she could see his back broad. Still, his elbows on his knees, the cup cradled low. She walked out and sat on the top step. 3 steps below him. The wood was cool through her skirt. They drank coffee and watched the sun push up over the eastern ridge. The light came in layers gray, then gold, then white, and the valley below the ranch filled with it like a bowl filling with water. Meadowlarks called from the fence line. The horses moved in the corral, their hooves soft on packed dirt. Neither of them spoke. It was the quietest breakfast Mary had ever had. And the strangest, because the silence wasn't the kind she knew. The kind that meant someone was deciding what to do with you. This was just silence. The ordinary kind. The kind between 2 people who had nothing they needed to say yet. Elias finished his coffee, set the cup on the step, and stood. "I'll be at the corral if you need me. Fence needs mending on the south side." He pulled his hat down and walked across the yard. Mary stayed on the porch. She watched him pump water from the well, the handle screeching with each stroke, and carry 2 full buckets to the horse trough. She watched him check the corral fence, testing each post with a shake. One wobbled. He marked it with a strip of cloth and moved on. She watched him split kindling behind the barn, the axe rising and falling in an easy rhythm, the wood popping apart clean. He worked the way some men breathe steady, unself-conscious, without looking up to see if anyone was watching. That afternoon, he came into the kitchen carrying short lengths of oak and a draw knife. He sat at the table and shaved 1 piece down, turning it, measuring it against his thumb. He didn't say what it was for. Mary washed the coffee cups and swept the front room and didn't ask. The next morning, the rocking chair in her room stood level. 4 legs on the floor, no wobble, no listing. The new leg was pale, fresh-cut oak, the grain still white against 3 dark ones worn smooth by years of use. She sat in it, rocked once, twice. The creak was even now, a steady back and forth. And through the window she could see Elias crossing the yard with the milk pail. And she rocked and watched and said nothing to anyone about anything. On the 3rd evening, she cooked. She'd found flour and lard and buttermilk in the hutch, the buttermilk slightly turned, but usable, and she made biscuits the way her mother had taught her in the kitchen in Harrisburg. Cut them with a water glass. Laid them on the baking sheet. The oven ran hot, and the bottoms came out dark, nearly black at the edges. And she stood over the pan and felt her face flush. She made gravy from the bacon drippings in the can beside the stove, poured it into a bowl, set the table 2 plates, 2 forks, the biscuits in a towel-lined basket. Elias came in from the barn, hung his hat on the nail by the door, and stopped. He looked at the table, looked at her, sat down. He ate 4 biscuits, scraped the gravy bowl with the last one, didn't comment on the burnt bottoms. After supper, he washed the plates she tried to take them, and he said, "I got it. Sit down," and dried them with the flour sack towel and put them back in the hutch. Then he reached for his hat. "Heading to Hargrove's store tomorrow for flour," he said, one hand on the door. "You need anything?" Mary stood by the table, the towel still in her hands. "More flour." "I reckon." She twisted the towel once. "And salt? We're low on salt." She heard him pause. The door didn't move. Then, salt it is, and his boots went down the steps and across the yard. Mary folded the towel, set it on the table, stood there. She replayed the sentence in her head. "We're low on salt," she had said. "We, not you, not the kitchen, we," as if this were her kitchen, her salt, her home. She walked to her room and sat on the bed and pressed her hands flat against her knees. The rocking chair stood in the corner by the window, steady on its 4 legs, 1 pale and 3 dark. Through the curtain, the barn loft lantern glowed. She did not lock the door, not because she trusted him, not yet, not fully, not the way trust is supposed to work, but because her hands were tired, and the crickets outside sounded like something she almost recognized. And the word "we" was still sitting in her chest like a stone she hadn't meant to swallow, warm and heavy and impossible to cough back up. 3 weeks carved a groove into the days. Mary learned the rhythm the way a body learns a new bed, not all at once, but in pieces, waking each morning a little less startled by the rooster, a little more certain of which floorboard creaked outside her door. Coffee at dawn. Elias gone to the corral by the time the sun cleared the ridge. The cook stove cooling while she swept, then heating again when she started supper. His boots on the porch at dusk. Always the same 2 heavy steps. The scrape of soles on the edge board. The hat going up on the nail. She cooked. He ate. They sat on the porch with their coffee and watched whatever the sky was doing. And most nights the only words between them were about weather or the garden or whether the bay mare's hoof was healing right. It was enough. It was more than enough. On a Tuesday, she'd started counting days by the garden, not the calendar. And Tuesday was the day the green beans needed picking. Elias came around the side of the house with a bushel basket and set it at the end of the row. "Beans are ready," he said. "You want, I can show you which ones to pull." Mary knelt at the near end of the row. The dirt was warm through her skirt, still holding the morning sun. Elias knelt 3 feet away, at the next plant, and reached into the tangle of leaves. "You're looking for the ones about this long." He held up a bean between his thumb and finger 4 inches. Firm. No bulge from the seeds inside. "If they're lumpy, leave 'em. Those went too far." She nodded, reached in. The leaves were rough against her wrists, the stems sticky with something that smelled green and sharp. She snapped a bean off and held it up. "That's the one," he said. They worked down the row in silence. The sun climbed. Sweat gathered at her hairline and ran down her temple. The basket filled a slow, satisfying sound, each bean landing with a soft tap against the others. Somewhere in the pasture, a meadowlark called 3 notes and stopped. Elias reached across to pull a bean she'd missed, low on the vine. His hand brushed hers. Mary jerked back, fast. The way you pull away from a hot stove before thinking, before deciding. The body making the choice on its own. Her hand went to her chest, and she knelt there, breathing through her nose, staring at the dirt between her knees. Elias didn't look at her. He stood up, slow, and walked to the next row of the tomatoes and crouched down beside a plant heavy with green fruit. "Tomatoes are coming in good this year," he said, his voice the same as before, steady and flat, as if nothing had happened. "Might have enough to put some up. You ever done any canning?" Her heart was hammering against her fist. She made herself breathe, in, out. The dirt smelled like iron and rain. "Some," she said. "My mother put up tomatoes every August." "Well then." He turned a tomato over in his hand, checking the underside. "We'll have more than we know what to do with. Come a few weeks." Mary looked at her own hand, the one he'd touched. The knuckles were dirty, the nails trimmed short, the skin across the back starting to brown from the sun. Just a hand. Nobody's weapon. She picked up another bean and snapped it off the vine. That evening, after supper, Elias didn't go straight to the barn. She heard him moving in the front room, the scrape of something being lifted off a shelf. A soft breath blown across metal, and then the plank door groaned open, and his boots went down the steps and across the yard. But they stopped before the barn. The porch. He was on the porch. Then came a sound she didn't recognize. A thin, reedy note, wavering, followed by another lower, steadier. A melody, if you could call it that. Simple. Slow. The kind of tune a man plays when he's not trying to play anything in particular, just pressing his mouth against brass and seeing what comes out. Harmonica. She'd seen it sitting on the barn shelf 3 weeks ago when she'd gone to fetch the egg basket, a small brass thing. Tarnished. Gathering dust. He must have walked past it every night climbing up to his cot. 3 weeks of looking at it before picking it up. Mary stood at the cook stove, a dish rag in her hand, and listened. The notes wandered no song she knew, no pattern she could follow. He missed a high note, and the sound cracked, and he found it again. Lower, and kept going. She hung the rag on the stove handle, walked to her room, stood at the window. The curtain was drawn, the flour sack cloth hanging limp in the still air. Through it she could see the shape of him on the porch step, elbows on his knees, the harmonica small and dark in his hands. She reached up and pushed the window open. The night came in, warm air, sage-heavy, carrying the harmonica and the crickets and the smell of the pasture grass drying in the dark. She stood there and let it come. He played for maybe 10 minutes, maybe less. The tune got slower, then stopped. She heard him tap the harmonica against his palm, clearing the spit, and then his boots going across the yard to the barn. Mary closed the window. Not all the way. She left a 2-inch gap at the bottom. And she went to bed with the night air moving across the sill. The next evening, she baked a rhubarb pie. The rhubarb grew wild along the fence line she'd spotted the thick red stalks 2 weeks ago and had been eyeing them since, waiting until she trusted the oven enough to try. She cut the stalks, chopped them, mixed them with sugar and a pinch of flour for thickening. The crust she made from lard and cold water, rolling it out on the floured table with a glass jar because there was no rolling pin. It came out rough at the edges, uneven, but it held together. The filling bubbled through a crack in the top, and the smell filled the kitchen tart and sweet. The sugar browning at the edges. She set it on the table next to the beans and cornbread. Elias ate his plate clean. Then he ate a second slice of pie, scraping the dish with his fork. He set the fork down and looked at the empty dish with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something between surprise and the absence of it. "You much of a reader?" he said. The question came from nowhere. Mary set down her fork. "What do you mean, books, reading? You do much of it." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I used to teach children back home, little ones, letters, mostly, how to sound out words." The cup was warm. She pressed her thumbs against it. "Before things got—" She stopped. The sentence hung there between them like a thread pulled from a hem visible. Fragile. Leading somewhere she wasn't ready to go. Elias picked up his fork again, though the dish was empty, and turned it over on the table. "Old Martha Hargrove's been griping about her grandkids," he said. "Tommy's 9 and can't spell worth a lick. Whole town's the same, from what I hear." He set the fork down, picked up his coffee. "Somebody ought to do something about that. I reckon." He drank. Didn't look at her. Mary sat very still. The cook stove ticked behind her, the fire burning down. The iron contracting in the cooling air. Outside, the first crickets started. He wasn't asking her to teach. He wasn't suggesting or proposing or hinting. He was just setting a fact on the table. The way he'd set the bushel basket at the end of the bean row. Here it is. Pick it up or don't. "I don't have any books," she said. "No primers, no chalk, nothing." Elias stood and carried his plate to the basin. "Hargrove's store's got a little bit of everything. We could look." There it was again, that word, small as a seed, dropped into the space between them without ceremony. Mary stared at the empty pie dish. The rhubarb juice had stained the tin dark pink, and she thought about Tommy Hargrove, 9 years old, who couldn't write his own name. And she thought about the schoolroom in Harrisburg, the one her brother had locked her out of, and her fingers tightened around the coffee cup until the tin edge pressed a white line into her skin. "When," she said, Elias hung his hat on the nail, turned back. "Saturday work for you. Saturday. 3 days from now. 3 days until she'd have to sit on that buckboard and ride into a town full of strangers and be seen the rancher's mail-order wife with the fading bruise and the Pennsylvania accent and nothing to her name but a broken valise and a skill that the last man in her life had beaten her for using." Her mouth went dry. "Saturday's fine," she said. Saturday came the way weather comes in Wyoming, slow, until it's suddenly on top of you. Mary dressed in the calico, the faded one, the only one that didn't have a mend across the bodice. She braided her hair tighter than usual, pinned it twice, checked it with her fingers. The bruise on her cheekbone had faded to a faint yellow-green. Barely visible, unless you were looking. People would be looking. She found Elias already hitching the bay mare to the buckboard. He'd put on a clean shirt cotton. Dark blue. The collar pressed with what she suspected was a hot pan lid, because no man living alone owned a flat iron. His boots were brushed. His hat was the same. "Ready," he said. She climbed up, gripped the seat rail with both hands. The road to Cedar Hollow ran 4 miles through open grassland, then dropped into a shallow valley where the creek cut through cottonwood and scrub willow. The morning was already hot, the air dry and bright, the kind of heat that pressed against your skin like warm cloth. Grasshoppers jumped ahead of the wheels. Dust rose behind them and hung in the still air. Mary didn't speak for the first 2 miles. Her jaw was clenched so tight her back teeth ached. She loosened it, clenched again. Her hands on the rail were white at the knuckles. Elias drove with one hand on the reins, the other resting on his knee. He didn't fill the silence, didn't whistle or hum or make conversation about the heat. He just drove, and let her sit with whatever was happening inside her. Cedar Hollow appeared around a bend, a single street of plank front buildings, most of them unpainted, a few whitewashed. Hargrove's general store on the left, its porch stacked with barrels and crates. The post office window beside it, the American flag hanging limp above the door. A blacksmith's shop with its doors thrown open. The anvil quiet this morning. A white clapboard church at the far end, its steeple barely taller than the cottonwoods behind it. And behind the church, set back from the road, a building Mary hadn't expected. A storage barn. Maybe 20 feet wide, plank-sided. The roof pitch steep enough to shed snow, its door hung crooked on one hinge. 2 of the 3 windows still had glass. Elias pulled the buckboard to a stop in front of it. "Reverend Thomas said folks can use this," he said. "Needs fixing up, but the bones are good." He wrapped the reins around the brake handle, cracked his knuckles one hand, then the other. "If you wanted to, teach." Mary looked at the building. The door hung open about a foot, and through the gap she could see a plank floor, dusty but solid. Sunlight came through the 3 windows and fell in bright rectangles on the wood. She climbed down from the buckboard before Elias could offer his hand. The door scraped against the floor when she pushed it wider. Inside, the air was hot and still, smelling of old hay and sun-baked wood. The room was a single space, no partitions, no furniture, cobwebs in the rafters, mouse droppings along the baseboards, but the floor was sound under her boots, and the walls were straight. And when she stood in the center of the room and looked at those 3 windows, 3 squares of Wyoming light falling clean on the planks, something turned over in her chest that she didn't have a name for. She put her hand on the doorframe. The wood was rough under her palm, splintered at the edge, warm from the sun. Mary. A voice behind her, not Elias. She turned. A woman stood at the bottom of the church steps, arms folded across a burlap apron. 60 years old, maybe more. White hair pulled back in a knot so tight it stretched the skin at her temples, broad through the shoulders, hands red and thick-knuckled. The hands of someone who'd spent decades hauling flour sacks and wringing wash. The woman walked over with a stride that covered ground. She stopped 3 feet from Mary and looked her up and down, a frank, measuring look. No apology in it. Her eyes passed over the faded calico, the boots with their cracked soles, the place on Mary's cheekbone where the bruise had been. She didn't ask. She stuck out her hand. "Martha Hargrove, I run the store with my husband, who's useless before noon." Mary took the hand. The grip was hard, calloused, dry, warm. It squeezed once and let go. "My Tommy can't write his own name and he's 9 years old," Martha said. "His pa thinks that's fine, but his pa's an idiot. And I say that with 30 years of Christian marriage behind me." She put her hands on her hips. "Elias says you taught school back east." Mary glanced at Elias. He stood by the buckboard, arms crossed, looking at the church steeple as if it were the most fascinating structure ever built. "I taught children their letters," Mary said. "Reading. A little arithmetic." "Can you teach a boy to write his name so's a person can read it without squinting?" "Yes, ma'am." Martha nodded once, a sharp downward jerk of the chin. "Then I'd say we got business. I've got 3 grandchildren and the Patterson girls down the road, And Millie Thomas, that's the Reverend's girl. 6 and shark sharp. She looked at the barn behind Mary. Place needs work. I'll get my 2 grandsons and the Patterson boy to help me haul it out. Give us a couple weeks and we'll have it right. Mary opened her mouth, closed it. She looked at the old storage barn behind her, the dust, the cobwebs, the mouse droppings, the 3 windows full of light. It would need a board, she said. Something to write on. And chalk. The board. Elias can handle. Man's got more lumber than sense. Martha said it loud enough for Elias to hear. He didn't turn from his study of the steeple, but his jaw shifted. Martha looked at Mary again. Softer this time, or not softer exactly, but steadier. The way you look at something you've decided about. 2 weeks from Monday, Martha said. That's when we open. You just bring yourself. She turned and walked back toward the store, her boots striking the packed dirt in a rhythm that suggested she'd already moved on to the next task in her head. Mary stood in the doorway of the barn. Her hand was still on the frame. She could feel her own pulse in her fingertips, pressed against the rough wood. On the ride home, she was quiet for the first mile. The buckboard creaked over the creek bridge, 2 logs and a plank, the water low and clear underneath, and the cottonwoods threw shifting shadows across them. Then, without looking at Elias, I'd need chalk, a slate board, and a McGuffey's, if you can find one. She paused. Her hands were in her lap now, fingers laced, squeezing. And I don't have a proper dress for teaching. I mean, the calico's too faded. Elias kept his eyes on the road. Hargrove's got calico by the yard, blue, I think. He shifted the reins to one hand. We'll figure it. Mary watched the road unspool ahead of them, the ruts and the dust and the grassland rolling out to the bighorns. She unlaced her fingers, laced them again. She'd asked for things. Chalk, and a slate, and a book, and fabric for a dress. She'd asked a man she'd known for less than a month for things she needed, and he hadn't flinched, hadn't asked what it would cost, hadn't said, "We'll see," in that voice she knew, the voice that meant no. He'd said, "We'll figure it," the way you'd say it about a fence post that needed replacing or a leak in the roof, just a thing to be handled, together. The buckboard rolled past the last line of cottonwoods and out into open grass, and the sun hit them full and hot. And Mary Colton sat on that bench and felt something she hadn't felt since the last time she'd stood in front of a classroom in Harrisburg, a pull forward. A direction. The terrifying, specific weight of being needed by someone other than the people who'd told her what she was. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs and stared straight ahead. And she did not let herself think about what had happened the last time she'd tried to teach. Because if she thought about that, about Dale's hand on the schoolroom door, about the lock turning from the outside, about the 3 days before someone let her out, she would not get on this buckboard 2 weeks from Monday, and she was going to get on this buckboard 2 weeks from Monday. The schoolhouse opened on a Monday in the first week of August, and by the second week, Mary had 5 students and a routine she could feel in her bones. She rang the bell at 8, the small brass one Martha had lent from the store counter, until a proper one could be found, and the children came. Tommy Hargrove, 9, red-haired, big-eared, who held his chalk like a weapon and wrote with his tongue between his teeth. The Patterson sisters, Agnes, 10, and Ruth, 7, who walked 2 miles from the ranch south of the creek and arrived every morning with dust on their hems and wildflowers in their fists. Samuel Wick, the blacksmith's boy, 11, shy, who sat in the back and drew horses on his slate when he thought she wasn't looking. And Millie Thomas, the Reverend's daughter, 6 years old, who could already read the first 3 chapters of the McGuffies and raised her hand before Mary finished asking the question. The schoolroom still smelled of old hay, but the floor was swept clean and the cobwebs were gone, and Elias had built a writing board from pine planks. Sanded smooth and painted black with a mixture of lamp soot and linseed oil. It wasn't perfect. The surface was uneven, and the chalk skipped in the low spots, but it held letters. And that was enough. Mary taught the way she'd always taught, slow, patient, one letter at a time, one sound at a time, building words the way you build a stone wall piece by piece, testing each one before setting the next. She made Tommy trace his name on the slate 20 times before letting him try the board. She had the Patterson girls read aloud to each other, taking turns, correcting gently. She let Samuel draw his horses and then asked him to label the parts: mane, hoof, tail, bridle, and watched his spelling improve without him noticing. On Thursday of the 2nd week, Millie wrote a poem, 4 lines, crooked on the slate, the letters uneven. The sun is hot, the dirt is dry. My cat sleeps on the step, and so do I. Mary read it twice. She read it a 3rd time. She set the slate down on the desk and pressed her fingers against her mouth and made a sound that startled her, a short, involuntary thing. Half breath and half something else. Not quite a laugh. Close enough. She told Elias about it that evening, sitting on the porch with their coffee. The sun was going down behind the bighorns, and the light was the color of warm honey, and the crickets were just starting. She's 6, Mary said. 6 years old, and she wrote a poem about her cat. My cat sleeps on the step, and so do I. She shook her head. I read it 3 times, and I still don't know why it made me. She stopped, pressed her lips together. It just did. Elias was pulling his boots off, working the left one loose with the toe of the right. He looked at her a quick glance, sideways, the kind a man gives when he's seen something and isn't sure he's allowed to have seen it, and then looked down at his boot. Sounds like the girl's got a head on her shoulders, he said. She does. She's sharper than most adults I've met, and I include myself in that. He got the boot off, set it beside the step, started on the other one. You're doing a good thing, Mary. She turned the cup in her hands. The coffee was cooling. She took a sip, and it was lukewarm and bitter, and she drank it anyway. I'm doing the only thing I know how to do, she said. He didn't answer that. He got the 2nd boot off and set it next to the 1st, and sat there in his wool socks with his elbows on his knees, looking at the valley, and neither of them said anything for a while. And it was fine. The letter came on a Friday. Mary was at Hargrove's store buying chalk. She went through it fast, the children pressing too hard, snapping the sticks in half, and Martha was wrapping the box in brown paper when she paused. Almost forgot. She reached under the counter and pulled out an envelope. Brown paper. No return address. The handwriting on the front was heavy, slanting, careless, a hand that pressed too hard on the pen. That didn't care about neatness. Mary knew that handwriting the way she knew the sound of boots on stairs. She took the envelope. Thank you, Mrs. Hargrove. Martha watched her face. Bad news. My brother. Mary's voice came out flat, level, like reading a price tag. He writes sometimes. She walked out to the porch of the store, sat down on the step, tore the envelope open. The letter was short. Dale's letters were always short. He wrote the way he talked. In jabs. Mary driving cattle from Nebraska to Montana. Route takes us through Wyoming. Near your town. We'll stop by Thursday or Friday to see how you're getting on. Dale. She read it once, folded it, put it in her apron pocket. Her hands were steady. Her face was not. She could feel the blood leaving it, draining down through her neck and chest as if someone had pulled a plug. She stood up, walked to the buckboard, climbed up, set the chalk box on the seat beside her, and waited for Elias, who was at the blacksmith's getting a hinge repaired. She didn't speak on the ride home. Elias glanced at her twice. She saw it from the corner of her eye. The small turn of his head, but he didn't ask. He drove. She sat with her hands in her lap, the letter in her pocket pressing against her hip like a coal. At the ranch. She didn't go inside. She walked past the porch, past the well, past the corral fence, and into the garden. She knelt at the tomato row and started pulling weeds. Not the way she usually weeded, careful, selective, pinching the base and drawing the root out whole. This was different. She grabbed fistfuls, ripped. Dirt flew up her forearms and onto her apron. She pulled a weed and half a tomato seedling came with it, and she didn't stop. Her fingers dug into the hot Wyoming clay and tore at whatever they found, and her breath came fast through her teeth. Elias found the letter on the kitchen table. She'd left it there, not deliberately, not accidentally, just left it, the way you leave a thing you can't hold anymore. She heard the plank door open. His boots on the dirt, crossing the yard, stopping at the garden's edge. He didn't say anything. He walked to the next row, the green beans, the ones they'd picked together 3 weeks ago, already growing a second crop, and sat down in the dirt, just sat, cross-legged, like a man settling in for a while. Mary ripped another weed. Her knuckles were raw. There was dirt under every nail, and a scratch across her left palm where a root had cut her. Mary. She didn't look up. Ain't nobody rides onto my land that you don't want here. His voice was low. Even. The same voice he used with the horses. You hear me? Her hand stopped. A clump of weed and dirt hung from her right fist, roots dangling. She was breathing hard. Sweat ran down her temples and dripped off her jaw into the dirt. She looked up. He was sitting 3 feet away, in the bean row, his hands resting on his knees, dirt on his trousers, dirt on his boots. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the rocking chair before he fixed it steady, measuring, already working out what needed doing. She looked back, not a glance, not the careful, angled look she'd been giving him for weeks, the one that took him in sideways. Without commitment. Ready to cut away. This was straight on. Eyes to eyes. His were not brown. She realized. They were dark green, like creek water in shade. She'd been living in this man's house for 6 weeks, and she hadn't known the color of his eyes until this moment. Kneeling in the dirt with weed roots in her fist, and her brother's letter on the kitchen table. Thursday, she said. He said Thursday. Elias nodded. All right. He's not a good man. Elias, I figured. She dropped the weeds, pressed her dirty palms flat on her thighs. The scratch on her left hand stung where the sweat got into it. He'll want to take me back, she said. He'll say it's what Pa wants. He'll say I don't belong here. Elias picked up a clod of dirt and broke it between his thumb and finger. The dry clay crumbled and fell. Do you, he said, belong here? The question sat in the air between them. The tomato plants rustled in a breeze she couldn't feel. A horsefly circled her head, and she didn't swat it. 6 weeks ago, she'd stepped off a stagecoach with a bruise on her face and a valise with one clasp, and the absolute certainty that she belonged nowhere. And now, a man with dirt on his hands was asking her, not telling her, not deciding for her asking. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I don't know," she said, "but I know I'm not going back." Elias brushed the clay dust off his hands, stood up, offered her his hand palm up, open, not reaching for her, just there. She looked at it, looked at him, she took it. His grip was firm and dry and warm, and he pulled her to her feet and let go the moment she had her balance. And they stood in the garden with 6 inches of August air between them and the sun dropping fast behind the mountains. "Thursday," Elias said. "I'll be here." He walked back to the house. She heard the plank door close, heard him moving in the kitchen, the stove door, the water pump, the sounds of a man starting supper because the woman who usually cooked was standing in the garden with dirt on her hands and a question in her chest that she couldn't answer yet, but that she'd heard, and that she would keep hearing. Through every hour between now and Thursday. "Do you belong here?" She didn't go to the schoolhouse on Monday. Martha came by in the afternoon, driving the store wagon, and knocked on the front door. Mary heard the knock from the rocking chair. She didn't get up, didn't move, didn't pull the flour sack curtain aside to see who it was. Elias met Martha in the yard. Mary heard their voices through the closed window low. Careful. The way people talk outside a sick room. "She all right?" Martha said. "She will be." "The children were asking for her." A pause. Then Elias. "Tell him she'll be back. Just needs a day." Martha's wagon creaked out of the yard. The hooves faded. Silence came back, heavy and complete. And Mary sat in the rocking chair and pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her finger until the skin turned white around the nail. She rocked. The chair was steady 4 legs, even. The pale one and the 3 dark ones, but she rocked too hard, too fast. The runners thumping the floor with each stroke. Her teeth were clenched. Her hands gripped the armrests until the tendons stood out across the backs of her hands. Elias brought coffee at noon. Set it on the nightstand beside the wilted, black-eyed Susans she'd never thrown out. The cup sat there all afternoon, going cold, a skin forming on the surface. When he came back at supper and saw it untouched, he picked it up without a word, carried it out. And she heard the liquid splash in the yard. He cooked that night. She could smell bacon and beans through the door. He set a plate outside her room. She heard the plate touch the floor, heard his boots retreat, and she sat in the dark and looked at the strip of lamplight under the door and didn't eat. At some point, the lamp in the front room went out. His boots crossed the yard. The barn door opened and closed. Mary sat in the rocking chair and felt herself shrinking. It was a feeling she knew had known since she was 14, and Dale first caught her reading to the neighbors' children. The way her body tried to take up less space, shoulders curling in, chin dropping, hands pulling close, as if she could make herself small enough to disappear. Small enough that nobody would notice her. Small enough that whatever was coming would pass over her the way weather passes over a stone. She had done this in Harrisburg. After Dale locked her out of the schoolroom, after he told their father she'd been putting ideas in children's heads, making girls think they were as smart as boys, embarrassing the family. After her father had looked at her across the kitchen table and said nothing not one word, and Dale had said, "See, even Pa knows you're a fool." And she had sat in her room that night the same way she was sitting now, rocking, shrinking, becoming the thing they told her she was. She put her face in her hands, the worst part, the part that made her stomach turn, that made the back of her neck burn, was not the fear. It was the shame. That after 6 weeks of cooking and teaching and standing in her own garden with dirt under her nails, after asking for chalk and asking for fabric and saying the word "we" after all of that, one letter from Dale could fold her back up like a piece of paper and stuff her in a drawer. She'd spent 15 days standing in front of 5 children pretending she had the right, pretending she was somebody. And all it took was a few lines of Dale's handwriting to remind her that she was the same woman who'd been locked in a schoolroom for 3 days, who'd sat on the floor with her back against the door and her bladder aching because there was no chamber pot, and she'd held it until she couldn't. And the stain on her skirt, when they finally let her out, that stain, the smell of it, the way Dale's wife had looked at her and then looked away, that was who she was. Not the woman in the blue calico, not the teacher, the woman with the stain. Her throat closed. She bent forward, elbows on her knees, and pressed her forehead against her fists. Her breath came in short pulls through her teeth. Not crying, she wouldn't cry. She'd stopped crying the day she got on the train in Harrisburg, but something underneath crying. The dry, airless place below tears, where the body just clenches and holds. The bolt was locked. She'd slid it home that afternoon without thinking her hand had found it the way a tongue finds a sore tooth. She stayed like that a long time. Then she stood up and walked to the bedroom door and pressed her forehead against the wood and started talking. Not loud, not to anyone, just talking. The way you talk to yourself in an empty room when the silence gets too heavy to carry alone. I taught 6 children in Harrisburg. 6. The youngest was 5, and she learned to read Psalms by Christmas. Her voice was flat, low, each word stepping over something sharp. Dale found out. He said I was making a fool of myself. Making a fool of him. He said a girl who reads more than her brother is a girl who don't respect her family. She pressed her hands flat against the door. The grain of the oak was rough under her palms. I told him he was wrong. I said those children needed someone, and I was someone, and I wasn't going to stop. Her fingers curled against the wood. He locked the schoolroom, took the key, told the children's parents I wasn't right in the head, that I had spells. A breath, another, 3 days before anyone came, 3 days in that room. She stopped. Her forehead was still on the door. The wood was warm from her skin. On the other side, the floorboards creaked, once, then the soft sound of a body settling sitting down, back against wood. He must have come back from the barn. She hadn't heard him. She didn't know how long he'd been there. "I'm right here," Elias said. 3 words. Through oak, that was all. Mary slid down the door until she was sitting on the floor, her back against the same wood he was leaning on, 2 inches between them. She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them and pressed her spine against the door. The crickets sang outside. The sound came through the window gap, the gap that had been open every night since the harmonica, and it filled the space where words weren't. They sat like that. Long enough for the crickets to go quiet and start again. Long enough for the moon to shift the light across the floor. Long enough for her heartbeat to slow from her throat back down to her chest, where it belonged. At some point, she heard his knees crack as he stood. His boots crossed the front room. The plank door opened and closed. His steps crossed the yard to the barn. Mary sat on the floor with her back against the door and stared at the moonlight on the boards. Then she got up. Slow. The way you get up when your body is very heavy, and you have to convince each part separately. She stood in the dark room and pressed her hands flat against her stomach and breathed. She walked to the hook behind the door where the blue calico dress hung the teaching dress, the one Martha had sewn on her machine at the back of the store. She took it off the hook and laid it on the bed. She lay down next to it and closed her eyes and did not sleep. But she stayed there. And when the rooster crowed and the gray light came through the curtain, she got up and put it on. She braided her hair, pinned it, laced her boots. Her hands shook a fine tremor, the kind that lives in the fingertips, and she laced them anyway, pulling the knots tight. She opened the door. Elias was at the stove, coffee poured, biscuits in the oven. He looked at her, at the blue dress, at the braid, at the swollen skin around her eyes, and whatever he saw. He didn't comment on it. "Biscuits be ready in 10 minutes, he said. "You got time." Mary sat at the table and wrapped her hands around the hot coffee cup and held it against her chest. The heat spread through the tin into her palms, into her wrists. Her fingers were still trembling. The coffee surface shivered. "I'm going to the schoolhouse," she said. Elias opened the oven and checked the biscuits, closed it. "I know," he said. "And 2 days from now, Dale Colton would ride up that road and stand at the fence and look at his sister with those flat, measuring eyes, and Mary would have to decide with chalk still under her fingernails and her hands still shaking whether she was the woman he'd locked in a room in Harrisburg, or the woman sitting at this table in a blue dress who had just gotten up off a floor and opened a door all by herself. He came on a Thursday, late morning, when the sun was already high enough to press the shadows flat against the ground. Elias was mending the south fence, replacing the split rail that the bay mare had leaned through last week when he heard the hoofbeats on the road. Single rider, unhurried. The sound carried across the flat grass the way sound does in Wyoming when there's nothing between you and the horizon but air. He set the hammer down on the fence post and straightened, wiped his hands on his trousers, watched the road. The rider came around the bend from the direction of Cedar Hollow. A big man on a sorrel gelding, sitting heavy in the saddle, one hand on the reins and the other resting on his thigh, wide through the shoulders, red-faced from sun, or drink, or both. His hat sat pushed back on his head, cocky, careless, and as he got closer, Elias could see the family resemblance. The jaw, the set of the eyes, the way the mouth held itself in a shape that looked like a smile, but wasn't. Dale Colton reined up at the fence line and looked at the ranch the way a man looks at a horse. He's thinking about buying slow, calculating, adding things up. "Well, now," Dale said. He pushed his hat back another inch. "This is a nice little spread. Mary always did have a knack for landing somewhere soft." Elias put his hand on the top of the fence post. The wood was sun-warm under his palm. He didn't move to open the gate. Didn't step forward. "Help you with something," Elias said. Dale swung down from the saddle heavy, the stirrup leather groaning, and looped the reins around the fence rail. He stood on the road side of the fence and hooked his thumbs in his belt and grinned. Up close, his teeth were tobacco-stained. His knuckles were thick, the skin across them scarred and calloused in a way that had nothing to do with ranch work. Elias looked at those knuckles, looked at the size of the man's right hand. His own hand tightened on the fence post. "Just checking on my little sister," Dale said. "Long way from home. Pa wanted to know she's earning her keep." He looked past Elias toward the house. "She around?" "She's here," Elias said. Well, go on and fetch her. I ain't got all day got to rejoin the drive before they cross the powder. Elias didn't move. She knows you're coming. She'll come out if she wants to. Dale's grin lost some of its width. He tilted his head, studying Elias the way a dog studies another dog across a yard measuring. Sizing. Deciding whether to push. That how it is, Dale said. You speak for her now. I don't speak for anybody. Gate stays shut, is all. She can open it if she's a mind to. Dale laughed a short, hard sound. More air than humor. He leaned forward and rested his forearms on the fence rail. You know, Miller, when Mary left home, Pa and I figured she'd be back in a month. She ain't exactly what you'd call sturdy. The plank door opened. Both men turned. Mary stood on the porch. She was wearing the blue calico dress. Her hair was braided and pinned. Her hands hung at her sides, not balled, not gripping. Just hanging there, loose and deliberate, as if she'd thought carefully about what to do with them and chosen nothing. She came down the 3 steps, crossed the yard. Her boots crunched on the dry dirt. Elias watched her walk the way she kept her chin level, not lifted in defiance and not dropped in surrender, just level, the way you carry a thing that's full to the brim and can't afford to spill. She walked past him, close enough that her sleeve brushed his arm. She stopped at the fence, on the yard side, 2 feet from her brother. Dale looked at her the way he'd looked at the ranch that same appraising sweep, head to boots and back up. His eyes stopped at her left cheekbone, where the bruise had been. And something moved across his face, not guilt, but a flicker of recognition. The way a man glances at a mark he left on someone else's wall. There she is, Dale said. You look different, healthier. Mary said nothing. She stood there with the sun on her face and her hands at her sides, and let the silence stretch until Dale shifted his weight from one boot to the other. Pa wants to know you're being useful, he said. At least. Mary took a breath. Her ribs expanded under the blue calico. The breath went in slow and came out slower. Tell Pa I teach school here, she said. Her voice was quiet. Not a whisper quiet, the way a planed board is smooth. All the roughness taken off. Only the grain showing through. I got students who need me. She swallowed. The muscles in her throat worked. I teach children to read. I bake bread. I grow tomatoes. She stopped. Her right hand closed into a fist at her side, then opened again. Finger by finger. As if she were releasing something she'd been gripping for a very long time. I sleep in a house where the door locks from inside. Dale's grin was gone. He stood with his arms on the fence rail and looked at his sister with an expression that had gone flat and still. Mary's voice wavered on the last part, a tremor at the edge. Like a wire plucked too hard, but she held his eyes. I ain't his to worry about, she said. Not anymore. The yard was quiet. A horsefly buzzed around Dale's sorrel, somewhere behind the barn. The meadowlark called its 3 notes. The cottonwood by the well dropped a leaf that nobody watched fall. Dale looked at Elias. It was a look Elias knew had seen 100 times in cattle camps and Saturday night dances, the look a man gives another man when a woman has said something inconvenient. The silent appeal. You understand. She don't mean it. Elias looked back at him. Didn't nod. Didn't shrug. Didn't offer the easy alliance of a shared glance. Lady's said her piece, Elias said. Dale's jaw worked. The muscles at the hinge bunched and released. He straightened up from the fence rail and looked at Mary again, a longer look this time. Harder. The kind of look that in another place, at another time, would have come with a hand. But he was standing on the wrong side of a fence, on another man's land, and the woman in front of him was standing straight, and the man behind her had not moved, but also had not looked away. And something in the geometry of it, the fence, the yard, the distance kept Dale's hands where they were. He spat tobacco juice into the dirt, brown streak on dry ground. "Suit yourself, Mary." He unwrapped the reins from the rail, put his foot in the stirrup, swung up heavy, the saddle creaking. Then he stopped, looked back over his shoulder, not at Mary, at Elias. "She'll tire you out," Dale said. His voice had lost the grin. It was flat now, stripped. "She tires everybody out. You'll see." He turned the sorrel's head toward the road. Then, to the air, to nobody. "Pa'll hear about all this." He kicked the sorrel into a trot. Dust rose behind him. The hoofbeats faded, steady and diminishing. And Mary stood at the fence and watched until the dust settled and the road was empty, and there was nothing left of Dale Colton but the brown tobacco stain drying in the dirt. Her shoulders started to shake. It began small, a tremor between her neck and shoulder, the muscles jumping under the calico, and then it moved down her arms to her hands, which were still at her sides, and her fingers trembled, and her knees softened, and she reached for the fence rail and missed it. Elias stepped forward. Not fast 2 steps, measured. The way he'd cross a stall toward a horse that was about to go down, and his hand found her shoulder. His palm against the blue fabric, his fingers resting light on the curve of bone beneath. She didn't pull away. Her knees gave, and she sagged against the fence, one hand finding the rail now, gripping it. And Elias's hand stayed on her shoulder, not pulling, not turning her toward him, just there. The weight of a hand, the warmth of a palm, the specific fact of another person choosing not to leave. Mary pressed her forehead against the fence rail. The wood was hot from the sun. She could smell the cedar of the split rails, and the dust of the road, and the faint, sour trace of Dale's tobacco spit. And she pressed her forehead into the wood until the grain bit into her skin. She'd said it. She'd stood in front of him and opened her mouth, and the words had come out not perfect, not fierce, not the way they would in a story, but out, into the air, where he could hear them, and she could hear them, and neither of them could pretend they hadn't been said. She breathed against the fence rail. The shaking slowed. Elias's hand was still on her shoulder, and she could feel the calluses on his palm through the thin cotton. Each one a small, rough point of heat. She straightened up. Not all the way her back ached from the tension, from holding herself so rigid but enough to take her own weight. She turned her head and looked at him, and his face was close, closer than it had ever been, and she could see the lines around his eyes and the place where his jaw was still clenched and his irises dark green. Like creek water over stones, the same color she'd seen in the garden. "He'll tell Pa I've gone crazy," she said. Her voice was rough, used up. Elias's hand slid off her shoulder. He stepped back, gave her the space. "Let him tell what he wants," he said. Mary looked down at the tobacco stain in the dirt, already drying to nothing in the heat. In an hour, it would be dust again, and Dale would be 10 miles east with the cattle drive, and the fence would still be standing, and the schoolhouse would still need sweeping Monday morning. She let go of the rail, stood on her own feet. The trembling had stopped. Her hands were steady. And somewhere behind the exhaustion, behind the ache in her jaw and the salt sting in her eyes, a question was forming, not about Dale, not about the past, but about the man standing 3 feet away, who had kept his hand on a fence post and let her fight her own fight, and caught her when her knees buckled, and who was now looking at her with an expression she had never once in her life seen directed at her by anyone, the look of a person who was not surprised by what she'd done, who had been waiting for it the way you wait for something you planted to finally break through the dirt. What do you do with a man like that? A week passed. The tobacco stain in the dirt washed away with Tuesday's rain, and nobody mentioned Dale Colton's name again, except Martha Hargrove, who said it once, on Wednesday morning, standing on the store porch with her arms crossed. "Heard your brother rode through town Thursday," she said. "Stopped at the smithy to water his horse. Didn't care for the look of him." She uncrossed her arms and handed Mary the box of chalk she'd come for. "You all right?" "I'm all right, Mrs. Hargrove." Martha studied her face the way she studied a bolt of fabric looking for flaws, finding them, deciding they were livable. She nodded once and went back inside. 3 new students came that week. The Doyle boy from the ranch north of the creek, 11, embarrassed about sitting with younger children, but his mother had driven him there in the wagon and he wasn't about to argue with her in front of people. A girl named Sarah, whose family had just arrived from Missouri, still living out of the covered wagon parked behind the livery, and the blacksmith's younger daughter, who was 8 and already knew her letters, but wanted to learn sums because her father couldn't help her, and she'd heard the teacher could. 8 children. Mary counted them each morning when they filed through the door, and each morning the number held, and each morning it surprised her. Martha brought the bell on Friday. She carried it in both hands, a brass school bell, small enough to sit in a palm, polished until it caught the light. She climbed the steps of the schoolhouse and held it out. "Every proper school needs a bell," Martha said. "This one was my mother's. She taught in Columbus before the war, 30 years in one classroom. Rang this thing every morning at 8 sharp. Drove the neighbors half out of their minds." She turned the bell over. On the underside, scratched into the brass with something sharp, a pin, maybe, or a nail, were the initials E-R-H. Eleanor Ruth Hargrove. Tough old bird. You'd have liked her. Mary took the bell. The brass was warm from Martha's hands, heavy for its size. The handle was smooth, worn down by decades of the same grip, the same motion, the same 8 o'clock swing. "I can't take this. Mrs. Hargrove." "You ain't taking it. I'm giving it. There's a difference. And at my age I know which is which." Mary closed her fingers around the handle. She tied it with a leather cord to the nail above the schoolhouse door. Rang at once. The sound went out across the flat, bright, thin, clean, and bounced off the church wall, and came back softer. And Tommy Hargrove came running from behind the store with his slate under his arm, and his shirt untucked, and his face split wide with the kind of grin that only belongs to a boy who is running toward something. That afternoon, riding home in the buckboard, Mary told Elias about Tommy. "He wrote his name today," she said. The buckboard jolted over a rut, and she caught the rail and kept talking. "The whole thing, start to finish. Thomas. He's been working on it all week. The H gave him fits. He kept making it look like a chair, but today he got it. He held up his slate and his face just—" She searched for the word. The buckboard wheels creaked. A red-tailed hawk circled above the pasture. Riding a thermal, tilting on one wing, Elias kept his eyes on the road. lit up. Mary turned and looked at him. He was squinting against the late sun, the lines around his eyes deep, his jaw slack for once, not clenched, not working, just resting. Yeah, she said. Lit up. The buckboard rolled on. The road curved past the creek and the cottonwoods threw long shadows across the ruts. Mary sat on the bench and watched the shadows slide under the wheels, and she shifted her weight slightly. An inch to the left, and her shoulder was closer to his. Not touching. A hand's width apart, instead of a forearm's length. She left it there. Elias didn't move away. Didn't move closer. He drove with one hand on the reins and the other resting on his knee. And the warmth between them was the sun and the August air and something else. Something without a name that neither of them reached for. At the ranch. They sat on the porch, 2 cups, 2 chairs the ladder back he'd dragged from the barn last week and rewoven the seat with rawhide strips. Set beside the one that had always been there. The coffee was strong and black. She'd learned to make it the way he drank it, thick enough to stand a spoon in, and he'd never asked her to, and she'd never said she had. Martha's mother taught for 30 years, Mary said. Same classroom. Elias blew across his coffee. That a fact. 30 years, 1 room, 1 bell. She turned the cup in her hands. I can't even think past next Monday. Monday's plenty, he said. Monday's all you need. The meadowlarks sang their evening calls. The horses shuffled in the corral. From far off miles, maybe came the low sound of cattle moving, thinning out across the grassland until it was less a sound than a feeling in the chest. Mary put her cup on the porch rail. Elias. Thank you. For the schoolhouse. The fabric. Standing at that fence. He drank his coffee. Set the cup on the step between his boots. You stood at the fence. I just happened to be nearby. That's not true. Close enough. The dark came on. Stars appeared, first 1, then a handful, then the whole spill of them across the sky. More stars than she'd ever seen in Pennsylvania, where the coal smoke smudged the night into a low gray ceiling. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at them and thought about the Sunday mornings she'd spent in the Harrisburg church, staring up at the painted ceiling that was supposed to look like heaven, and how it hadn't looked like anything. This sky, right here, with the sage smell and the cricket sound, and the man beside her who was pulling his boots off one at a time. This was what that painted ceiling was trying to be. Elias went to the barn. Mary washed the cups, swept the kitchen, banked the stove. She stood in the front room and looked at the 2 chairs on the porch through the open doorway, side by side in the starlight. And she looked at the hutch, 5 plates and 5 cups now. Because she'd bought one at Martha's store last week and set it on the shelf without mentioning it, and Elias had noticed and said nothing. She went to her room, took the quilt from the cedar chest at the foot of the bed patchwork, blue and white triangles, hand-stitched, old. Somebody's mother or grandmother had cut those pieces and sewn them by lamplight, and the stitching was tight, and the fabric was soft from years of washing, and it smelled like cedar and lavender soap, and the flour that got into everything in this house. She carried it across the yard. The barn was dark, except for the lantern glow from the loft. She knocked on the door 2 knocks. Light, with her knuckle. Yeah. His voice came from above, muffled. It's me. A pause. The creak of the cot, his boots on the loft ladder. He appeared in the barn doorway, shirt sleeves rolled. No hat, his hair pressed flat on one side from the pillow. Mary held out the quilt. Nights get cool, she said. "Even in summer. Out here in the barn. I mean—" Elias looked at the quilt, then at her. The lantern light from the loft came down through the hatch and caught the side of his face, one eye lit. One in shadow. He reached out and took the quilt. His fingers brushed hers on the folded edge. She didn't pull back. "Thank you. Mary," he said. Her name without miss or ma'am, just the name. 2 syllables. The way you say the name of a person you know. She nodded. Turned to go. Got 3 steps across the yard. "Mary." She stopped, looked back. He stood in the barn door with the quilt against his chest, the blue and white triangles bright against his dark shirt. "That rocking chair," he said. "The one with the bad leg. What about it? I'm glad I fixed it." She looked at him. His face was serious the way it always was, but something at the corner of his mouth moved, not a smile, the ghost of one, the place where a smile would be if he ever let it finish. "You're a terrible liar." "Elias Miller," she said. "Those biscuits were burnt, and you know it." "Never said a word about biscuits." "You were thinking it." "Can't prove that." She stood in the yard with the stars above her and the dirt cool under her boots, and she felt her own mouth do something it hadn't done in a long time. Pull sideways. Just barely, just at the corner. A motion so small that in the dark he probably couldn't see it. She went inside, left the door unlatched, the plank door resting against the frame. The night air moving through the gap. In the barn. Elias climbed to the loft, unfolded the quilt, spread it over the cot. The fabric smelled like lavender and flower and the cedar chest it had lived in. He lay down and pulled it to his chest, and the weight settled over him not heavy, just present, the way a hand rests on a shoulder. He turned the lantern down. The barn went dark except for the starlight through the loft window. Across the yard, the kitchen lamp still burned a warm yellow square in the dark face of the house, and through the open door he could see the shape of the kitchen. The table, the 2 chairs pushed in, the hutch with its 5 plates and 5 cups. 5 cups. 2 chairs on the porch, a bell above a schoolhouse door. The lamp went out. The house settled into darkness. The door stayed unlatched. The quilt smelled like lavender. The crickets sang the same song they'd sung the night she arrived on the last stagecoach of the day, with a bruise on her face, and a valise with 1 clasp, and a letter that said, "She's your problem now." She was not his problem. She was not anyone's problem. She was a woman who taught children to write their names, and baked rhubarb pie, and said "we" when she meant the salt, and left the door unlatched when she meant something she wasn't ready to say out loud. The moon came up over the pasture, white blue on the grass. The crickets sang, and in the morning there would be coffee, 2 cups, and the sound of her boots on the kitchen floor before dawn. That feeling sitting in your chest right now, the quiet one. The one that doesn't have a clean name, let it stay a moment. It's familiar, isn't it? The kind of weight you carry after watching someone do a simple, decent thing for another person, and realizing how rare that is, and how much it costs, and how little it asks in return. Many of us have stood on one side of a door like that. Some of us have sat on the other. We've folded quilts for people we didn't know how to talk to yet. We've eaten burnt biscuits without comment, because the person who made them needed to know that what they offered was enough. We've said "we" when we weren't sure we'd earned the word, and we've heard it said back to us when we needed it most. Not every story needs to explain itself. Some just need to be set down gently. The way you set a coffee cup on a porch rail at the end of a long evening, still warm, not quite empty. Left there for the night air to finish. Thank you for sitting with this one. It was good to have your company.